Hi, I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Today we're going to be building this little TV stand here. And if you don't have a TV stand or someday outgrow the TV stand, that's okay too, because the shelf in here made for the DVD player and cable box can easily be outfitted with a drawer, and then it's just a little side cabinet. This thing is an interesting project in that 90% of it is made with pocket hole screws. It goes together very quickly, and I was able to use relatively inexpensive material like 1/4-inch plywood for a lot of it. The reason I could get away with that is this is going to be a painted piece, all except the top. The top is going to get stained and then polyurethaned, and because of that I made it out of solid pine, and it's the only glue up on this project. I want to get started gluing up these boards first because they have to sit in the clamps for a while, and while they're drying I can start working on other things. I'm in the process of laying out some lines for Biscuits, and as you can see, while these boards are fairly flat, they do have a little bit of a bow to them, so I need some way to keep the surfaces aligned as I glue it, so that way it reduces the amount of sanding I have to do. I'm cutting the biscuit slots in the edge of the workpiece to receive these number 20 biscuits. And the tool I'm using to cut those slots is known as a biscuit joiner. It kind of resembles an angle grinder, but instead of a grinding wheel, it has this spring-loaded base that reveals a saw blade. So when I set the fence to be the correct distance from the face of the board, all I have to do is line up the little index mark that's on the front of the tool with the line I drew earlier, squeeze the trigger, plunge it in, and I get a perfect biscuit slot every single time. I'm covering the pipes of the pipe clamps with blue painter's tape, so that way any glue that squeezes out the bottom is easier to remove, because sometimes it really sticks to these pipes. The other thing is, if the wood touches where the glue drips onto the pipe, it tends to leave a black stain on the wood that is very difficult to sand out. With a thin bead of glue spread on both sides of the board and down in the biscuit slots, I can go ahead and start clamping this together. I'm over at the rail arm saw getting ready to cut the bottom and top rails to length, and they're both going to be 10 1/4 inches, and they need to be exactly the same, so that way when I put the side together it comes out square and I don't have any gaps in the joints. To ensure that I get them exactly the same, I've set up a stop block, which you may recognize as a self-centering doweling jig. This also works really well as a stop block clamped to the fence of my radial arm saw. Each style is going to get taper on the bottom of it, and the easiest way I know to cut tapers is right here on the radial arm saw. Now the nice thing about the radial arm saw is because it cuts a curve in the table in line with the blade, all I need to do is transfer the line down to the bottom, and I can simply sight down the cut line and line it up with the curve on the table, and if I sight down the top with the blade, I can line it up exactly. Now this doesn't give me a lot of support, and the workpiece could twist as I'm cutting it, so it's not safe to just hold it like this and make the cut, plus that's not very repeatable. The other benefit of the rail arm saw is the fact that the table is made out of plywood. Because of that, I can screw auxiliary fences to it wherever I want. In this case, now that I've got it lined up, I'm going to attach this little fence right here. Now I can go ahead and make the exact same taper on all 4 styles. I think it's time that we take a quick look at what the side's going to be like. So I've got the rearmost style, I've got the bottom rail, just like that. I've got the top rail. Now you'll notice the top rail is 3/4 of an inch wider than the bottom. And that's because when we put the trim piece on the top that's 3/4 of an inch wide, the reveal that's left matches the 2.5 inches down here. So that way it looks the same. Now if I take the front style and put that up against it, you'll notice this front style is 3/4 of an inch skinnier than the rear style. And once again, that's because there's going to be something added to it. In this case, imagine this is the face frame. When we put the face frame on, that adds 3/4 of an inch of width to this front style, making that 2 inches just like the rear one. So when it's all said and done, its width will match that one. However, right now, it's 3/4 of an inch thinner. Now that creates a problem over at the rail arm saw to cut this taper. The problem is our add-on fence is designed for the 2-inch wide board. So if I put the 1.25 board up against it, you can see it's just going to cut off a tiny little taper on the thing, and that's no good. So I could reposition this thing, but chances of me getting it lined up so I get the exact same taper as before is pretty slim. So instead, what I can do is use one of the cut off scrap pieces from earlier and pad it out 3/4 of an inch. Now when I cut it, it's going to match the taper on the rear ones, and once I put it all together with the face frame, everything will look like it matches. I've marked a line on the style where the rail is going to meet up to it, and I've marked a line on the router table fence 2 inches on either side of where the bit just barely starts cutting. What this will do is allow me to plunge into the bit, push the style through, and stop with that chamfer staying 2 inches away from each rail. Once I do all the styles and rails, I'll come back, readjust the bit to a lower height, and then come an inch closer to the styles to give the little reveal that I'm looking for. Both styles need a rabbet in order to conceal the plywood back of the TV stand. And to make that rabbet, I've set up the rail arm saw in the outrip position with a dado head and 2 feather boards, one on either side of the blade. The feather boards will keep the style pressed firmly to the table, because if it was to lift up, it would change the depth of the rabbet, and that would spoil the workpiece. You'll notice that the blade rotates in this direction, so I have to feed the stock opposing the rotation of the blade. If I was to feed it the other way, it would grab the workpiece and just shoot it across the shop, and that's not what I want to have happen. And as you can see, we're left with a rabbet that is perfect for concealing a 1/4 inch plywood back. This will give me plenty of space to staple it on, and you can't see it from the side. There's a lot of different ways to join the rails and stiles together. You could do it with mortise and tenon joints, biscuit joints, stub tenons, or even dowel joints. Or if you want to get really fancy, there is always the Festool Domino loose tenon system. However, today I think I'm going to keep it simple and quick and go with pocket hole joinery. Now, the benefit to pocket hole joinery is, unlike mortise and tenon, I cut the rails to their final length. I don't have to account for any extra for the tenons, and I get the benefit of, once I screw these things together, I can remove the clamps, so I don't have to wait for these things to dry before I can move on to the next step. The way I drill the pocket holes is with this setup right here. This is a special jig that has hardened steel drill guides into which this step bit goes. The drill guides hold it at a 15-degree angle, so I get the consistent pocket angle every single time. But as interesting as the jig is, really the heart of this system is in the special bit. This is a step bit. It's got a 3/8 diameter shank that then steps down to an 1/8 inch diameter shank. That drills the pilot hole, and the 3/8 diameter drills the hole for the screw head, burying it below the surface. All I need to do is to take one of the rails and make sure that the bevel is facing out, stick it in the jig, clamp it in place. This one has a little air clamp, and I can go ahead and drill the first pocket hole. And just like that, I get a pocket hole. I'm in the process of assembling the sides, and all I'm doing is putting a small bead of glue where the two pieces join together. And then I'll clamp them. Then I can drive the screws. Again, the reason this really speeds up production is the fact that I don't have to wait for the glue to dry before I can move on to the next step. I've got the 1/4 inch sheet of plywood on my workbench, and it's supported on a couple scrap 2x4s, so that way the blade of the circular saw doesn't cut into the workbench top. And now all I need to do is rough cut the blanks I need for the sides. And I'm not setting up a straight edge on this because the straight edge clamp tends to bow this 1/4 inch thick plywood, and it doesn't grip real well. And I'm going to be cutting this to size on the table saw and the radial arm saw in a second, so if this cut isn't perfect, that's okay because I have this square cut to reference off of. And now I can rip two panels to 13 1/4. Now I'll cut the panels to length with the homemade panel cutting jig. I've sanded all the joints flush on the back, and I'm now rolling on a thin bead of glue in preparation for attaching the plywood. The plywood is what's going to give this piece the racking resistance it needs, and it also acts as the panel in the side. So what I want to do is make sure it's lined up to the rabbet and to the top. Once it's flush on the rabbet and the top, I can go ahead and clamp it in place. Now I can secure it with some 5/8 brads. The middle shelf in the TV stand is getting an edge banding applied because it's not going to be covered by the face frame, and you'd see the plywood edge when you open the doors. So to apply the edge banding, which is really just a piece of 3/4 inch thick pine ripped to 1 inch in width, I'm using more pocket hole screws. By clamping the edging down to the workbench, the way the screws are angled, I'm guaranteed to have those top surfaces flush. If I try it any other way, there's a good chance the angle of the screws would pull the joint out of alignment and might pull the edging down. I'm drilling some holes in this top frame that's going to attach the cabinet to the top of the TV stand. And if you notice, I just elongated that hole. These holes are going to be at the back of the cabinet, and what they allow for is changes in width on the top, because as a solid wood glue up, it's going to expand and contract with changes in humidity. And if I was to rigidly attach it to this frame that has grain going perpendicular to the grain on the top, that would create a situation where either the top would buckle or the top would split, and I really don't want it to do either one. By having the holes elongated, that allows a little bit of flexibility for seasonal movement. I'm ready to install the top frame to the first side of the TV stand, and if you notice, I have all the pocket holes that hold the frame together facing up. That way, once this thing's installed and the top is put on, I won't see any of these pocket holes. You'll also notice that I have pocket holes drilled in order to attach the top to the side. And with that and glue, I'm going to get a very strong joint. You might notice this extra piece of wood right here. Well, that is to help me install this frame, because with the angle of the pocket hole screws, if I didn't have a backer behind it, as I tried to tighten these down, there's a good chance this frame would slide down away from the top edge, and I want this to be flush with the top edge. So what I did is I took a 3/4 inch spacer and clamped this extra piece of wood in place, so that way, no matter how much the pocket hole screws try to pull the frame that way, it's locked in this position. So now all I need to do is add a little bit of glue to the edge of the frame, and I can go ahead and install the screws. Now the one thing this piece of wood doesn't align is the front edge, and in order for the face frame to fit correctly, I need to make sure that that's flush with the front. And now that it is, I can go ahead and screw it into place. There's going to be a shelf that's open in the front for the cable box and the DVD player to reside, and by having it open, the remotes will still work. I need to have that 4 inches down from the frame. In order to get it exact front to back, I cut a 4-inch piece of wood and then ripped it down the center to make 2 identical spacers. The shelf is going to have the pocket holes on the bottom, so that way I don't see it in the finished product. And by having the spacers, as much as the pocket holes might try to pull it up, I'm guaranteed to have the exact spacing I want. And by using 2 pieces that came out of the original piece of wood, I get an identical space in the front and the back. And again, I want to align the front so it's flush. I'm going to use the square just as a little bit of a brace while I get the first pocket hole screw in. I'm going to check once again that it didn't move, and it's still in place. So I can go ahead and drive the other screw. So I'll repeat the same process with the spacers and the pocket hole screws for the shelf behind the doors and the bottom of the cabinet. That way everything is consistent, and I can use these same spacers on the other side when I flip this over, so I'm guaranteed everything is uniform. Now comes the tricky part. I've got glue on all the shelves, and I've got to flip this thing over and set it on the other side. There. And now I'm going to nail through the 1/4-inch panel with some 5/8 brads just to make sure that's pushed up against the shelf fully. I'm ready to cut the 1/4-inch plywood that's going to become the back of the TV stand, but it's too big a cut for my little radial arm saw to make under normal circumstances. So what I've done is clamp a straight edge to the front of it, and I'm going to use that in conjunction with the straight edge on the table as my guide to feed it through the saw. Now that cutout will be for the cords that go from the DVD player to the TV. 46 3/4. That's perfect. Now you'll notice I put this pipe clamp on the diagonal and I've squeezed the carcass together because it wasn't quite square. And the way I knew that is the diagonal measurements were different. You want them to be the same. So what I did is I put a clamp across the long dimension and I split the difference so that both diagonals are the same length now. Now I can go ahead and nail the plywood on. With glue spread on all the mating surfaces, I can now go ahead and put the face frame on. So all I need to do is line up the biscuit slots. a dead blow hammer comes in very handy for this. Want to make sure it's flush down at the bottom and that it's flush at the shelves, and I can start tapping it home. Using pocket hole screws on this part of the face frame means I don't need extra clamps here. All my clamps can be dedicated to the outside. I need to route a groove in the edge of the breadboard end, and to do that I've set up a 1/4 inch spiral cutting bit in my router table, and I've marked the leading and trailing edge of the bit. I've also marked the breadboard end 1/2 inch in from the outside, so what I can do is slowly plunge it down onto the bit, push it until I get to the stop point, and lift it back up. Now I've tried to set this exactly in the middle, but to make sure I get a groove that is perfectly centered, I'll flip it end for end and repeat the process, ensuring I get a centered groove. I'm going to do this in 2 passes because it is a 1/4 inch diameter bit, and I need to go to 3/4 of an inch depth. So that's a little bit too much to do all at one time. I've put a 3/4 inch bit in my router, and I've equipped it with a straight edge, and I'm going to use this to cut the tongue for the breadboard end. What I'll do is make a pass on this side, flip it over, make a pass on the bottom side, and then make any adjustments I need to the depth to get a snug fit in the slot. I'm using my dovetail saw to trim off the end of the little tenon. That way the end of the breadboard can fit over it. Now the fit from the router is a little tight, and that's okay. That's actually what I want because I'm going to fine tune it with this homemade rabbiting plane. I'll take a couple passes on the top and a couple passes on the bottom and just keep trying it until I get a snug fit, but one that I don't have to hammer it on. If I try to hammer this thing on, there's a good chance it's going to split this breadboard end. I've drilled 3 holes through the breadboard end and through the tongue. What I need to do now is elongate the 2 outermost holes, so that way this top can expand and contract with changes in humidity without splitting the top apart. That should be good right there. Now I don't want the dowel in the center coming out, and I'm not afraid to get glue down in the hole because the whole center portion of this is glued together. So I'll put glue on the dowel, then hammer it home. Right there. Now I'll take my dovetailing saw and just trim it off above the glue line. Now on the ends it's a little different. I don't want glue to actually hit the tenon. So what I'm going to do is put it in part way, just put a little bit of glue on it and hammer it the rest of the way home. I'm using a flush trim bit in my router to trim the face frame of the TV stand flush with the side. It's a whole lot easier than trying to make the face frame be the exact size it needs to be. In this case, I just made it a 1/16 of an inch wider in each direction, so I'd have a 1/16 of an inch material to trim off. I've got a 3/8 rabbiting bit set up in my router, and I'm using that to cut a 3/8 by 1/4 inch rabbet in the back of each of the doors because I don't want to see the plywood edge from the back. So by making this rabbet, I'll be able to glue and nail the plywood down into it and won't see any plywood edges. I've got the rabbiting bit set up in the router table now, and I'm rabbiting the outside of the doors a 1/4 of an inch at a time because this is a lot of material to take off, and even though the router might be able to handle it, I'll get a better cut if I do it a little at a time. Plus that's a 1/4 inch shank bit, so there's only so much it can do at a time. The hinges I bought for the TV stand are designed for a 3/4 inch thick door. However, this is 5/4, which actually ends up being 4/4 of an inch thick, so 1 inch. What that means is that I'm going to have to cut a mortise in the back of the door to receive this hinge if I want it to sit down in that rabbet correctly. The first thing I did was lay out where I wanted the hinge to be placed, and I have it so that the bottom screw hole for the hinge is going to be right in line with the top of the stile. I think that'll look the best when it's on the cabinet. Once I trace the hinge, I can go ahead and use a little square and my utility knife to cut the fibers where the mortise is going to be. That's going to reduce the chances of tear out when I start cutting the mortise. I've put the 3/4 inch bit back in my router, and I'm going to use that to route out the bulk of the material for this mortise, and that does two things. One, it's a lot faster with that router bit than it is with a chisel and hammer. The other thing is I've set the bit to the correct depth for this mortise. That means that once I route out the bulk of it, the depth is set, and that gives me a reference for the chisel. I need to round over the corners on the plywood so that way it fits into the rabbet in the door, and the easiest thing to do that is the belt sander. And with a thin bead of glue in the rabbet, I can put the plywood panel down in place, and then I'll hold it with some 5/8 brads. As much as I like pocket hole jointery, and it certainly has helped quite a bit with this project, I don't want to see the pocket holes once I sand and paint this door. So to get around that, what I'm doing is I'm gluing in these pre-made plugs. And I bought these plugs at the lumber yard that I bought the pocket hole screws at. And the nice thing is you just put a little bit of glue on them and put them right in the pocket hole itself. And when you sand that thing flush, you're never going to see it. Sometimes these plugs don't fit quite as snugly as I would like them to. So what I found is if I smear glue on them and then just take some sanding dust. This happens to be dust from when I sanded the top, and I just smear that around. That'll fill in any little gaps around the plug, and when I sand this smooth and paint it, you will never see that we use pocket hole joinery right here. I'm installing the top right now, and I figured the easiest way to do is to actually flop the cabinet on its back. That way I can center it, clamp it in place, and then drive the screws. And this is a little tricky because there's just barely space in there for my right angle drill. But luckily it's working. Installing the doors is also easier when the cabinet's on its back. The other nice thing about doing it this way is I can clamp a straight piece of wood to the top of the doors to keep them lined up, so that way I know when I install the hinges the tops are going to match up, and because they're the same height the bottoms are going to match up. There's only one last piece of woodworking I need to do to this TV stand before it's ready for paint, and that is to give it a piece of molding under the top to be a transition piece from the top to the case. And what I've come up with is this right here. And I just made this over on the shaper. Now I don't have a cutter for the shaper that'll make this profile right here. What I do have is one that'll make this cove and one that'll make this quarter round detail. And by doing it in two passes with two different cutters, I'm left with this S shape here, and I think that'll look pretty nice right along the top. I've changed out the cutters in the shaper with this one, and I'm using the bottom portion of it to get the final piece of the profile. I can go ahead and glue the molding to the side of the case. That won't hurt anything. As long as I don't get glue on the top, it'll still be able to expand and contract. I'm going to take the piece molding for the front and use it to line up where this needs to go in the corner. Once I'm happy with the fit, I can go ahead and nail it with some 3/4 inch brads. Now I'll cut the front piece to size and work my way around, and this thing's ready for some paint.